This November, no matter the outcome, we will elect our 47th chief executive. But first, we're going to take a look back at how the presidents became president. This is your countdown to 47. We've now reached JFK, John F. Kennedy. Prior to becoming the 35th president, JFK attended Harvard and graduated in 1940. He then enlisted in the Navy, and the United States entered World War II in December of 1941. After completion of naval training, a young Ensign Kennedy was whisked to the Pacific. On August 1, 1943, Kennedy was on board the PT-109 when it was split in two and sunk after it was rammed into by a Japanese destroyer. Kennedy was thrown from the deck and sustained injuries to his back. Despite this, he led the survivors, including carrying another injured crew member through the water on a 5-hour swim to a nearby island, where he and the survivors were rescued 1 week later. Following the war, Kennedy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1946 and was re-elected in 48. While in this role, Kennedy vied for a seat in the U.S. Senate, campaigning across Massachusetts. In 1952, his years of campaigning paid off with his election victory over the incumbent Republican senator. A Navy war hero and a senator, Kennedy was seen as a prominent candidate for the vice presidency in 1956, but he lost the nomination. Despite this defeat, Kennedy's popularity soared, and in 1960 he was nominated by the Democrats on the first ballot, beating out Lyndon Johnson, who he tapped as his running mate. Kennedy faced off with Vice President Richard Nixon of California in the general election. The two participated in the first televised presidential debate on September 26 that year. Kennedy campaigned on a platform of domestic, social, and economic reform, promising a new frontier. Kennedy won the election over Vice President Nixon by just 118,000 votes, becoming the youngest president ever to be elected. In January 1961, Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he made his famous appeal to the virtue of American citizens.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
As president, Kennedy sought expansive economic growth, making good on his pledge to get America moving again. Just months into his term, President Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress where he pushed the space race.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Kennedy also sought to provide economic and social aid to developing Latin American nations through the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps programs. However, not all the nations were friendly with the U.S., namely Communist Cuba. Later that year, JFK gave the go-ahead for a CIA plan to invade Cuba. However, the invasion was a failure and negatively influenced relations with the neighboring island nation as well as with the Soviets. These tensions led to the raising of the Berlin Wall, separating the U.S.-influenced western part from the Soviet-controlled east. These tensions came to a head in October of 1962 when U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviets' pursuit of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a nearly 2-week stalemate where the threat of a direct conflict with the Soviets and a nuclear war was the highest it has ever been. Kennedy pushed for a show of strength and restraint. The crisis ended when the Soviets backed down and the tensions began to cool once again. Kennedy's handling of the crisis bolstered his reputation at home and abroad. President Kennedy also took action toward the cause of equal rights, calling for new civil rights legislation, eventually culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. JFK, eyeing for re-election, sought to drum up support for his new frontier policies. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy traveled to Dallas, Texas as part of a 2-day tour of the state. Kennedy was riding in a motorcade with his wife Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife when 3 shots rang out. The second and third bullets hit the president. The third shot proved fatal. Barely past his 1,000th day in office, President Kennedy was slain by an assassin's bullet. John F. Kennedy served as President of the United States from 1961 until his death in 1963. It was now up to incoming President Johnson to lead the heartbroken nation. I'm Eric George for Valley News Live, and this has been your countdown to 47.